You've tuned into InvisiYouth Chat Sessions, a video podcast series. Our episode starts right now. Here's your host, Dominique Vale.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the InvisiYouth Chat Sessions, where you can check in for your dose of stigma-breaking, humor-filling, motivation-loving life hacks and advice for all of the medically adultish people in your life. You know, I'm Dominique Vale, founder of InvisiYouth and host of the InvisiYouth Chat Sessions podcast, and today is season 4, episode 54, and I'm very excited because I'm going to drop some statistics to start off the episode. So get this couple stats that I'm going to have. In the United States alone, 95% of people are in favor of organ donation, but only 58% are actually registered. And every 10 minutes, someone is added to the organ waiting list. So that's really important facts to think about because there's so much misinformation or misconceptions when it comes to organ donation and the transplant process. And when you're able to think about how to register or what that process would be like for yourself, you would want to get as much information as possible. And at InvisiYouth, we always say, learn from somebody who's gone through the experience so you can make the most well-rounded decisions for yourself. So I'm thrilled today because our special guest is going to be doing exactly that with me today. She is a Donate Life ambassador and a liver transplant recipient, Meghan Smith, aka Meghan Making Waves on Instagram. And we are going to talk about her own transplant journey and learn and have a fun chat about organ donation and the transplant process. So now Meghan is a marketing executive for a global affiliate marketing company. And when she was 22, Meghan discovered that she had a rare genetic liver disease and ended up not falling into the parameters of the waiting list. And luckily, her uncle was a donor match for her and became her living donor. And at 27, she got her liver transplant. Add into the mix that her younger brother also had a liver transplant 3 years prior without liver issues being in their family's medical history. So we love a good rare disease story at InvisiYouth. You know that as well. So now as a post-transplant, Meghan became an ambassador for Donate Life America and helps educate others on organ donation. And her positive, really open-minded, realistic approach to this platform really is what has inspired us. She's been one of our spotlight story writers at InvisiYouth last year. And so we're thrilled to have Meghan as now a podcast guest for InvisiYouth. So Meghan, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
It's going to be a blast. Like I said, when we chatted beforehand, having people who get to be at different parts of InvisiYouth's programming is fun. So I'm thrilled to have you writing for us and then now being a guest for us.
Yeah, it's great.
And we're going to jump right in and go into our first segment called Break That Glass Ceiling.
Break that glass ceiling. Break that glass ceiling.
Since we're chatting about organ donation and the transplant experience, we want to give you the down low on the topic. And we're not a textbook teaching kind of nonprofit. We like having fun chats about it. So with Meghan, we are going to be answering some of those common questions about these two topics beyond teaching you what they are in their words, because it's sort of self-explanatory. So those portions you're not going to learn from us because it's obvious. So kind of right off the bat, some of the most commonly asked questions about organ donation that we'll hear about, especially online, is that the process is probably very challenging to register, or it might cost something to be a donor. So what were answers to those quick questions?
Sure. So the registration process is actually extremely easy, and there's a few different ways that you can do it. There's, the traditional way of going to the MVA and getting that organ donation on your license and doing it that way. But even more so and quicker is you can go to registerme.org. That's the national registry. And you can also actually, if you're an iPhone user within your health app, you can become an organ donor that way too. So there's a lot of, really easy at your fingertips ways to register. And it does not cost anything to register, and it does not cost anything to be an organ donor. Any of the medical costs associated with organ donation, beyond, your hospital care before that or any funeral arrangements, all of the organ donation aspects of that are completely paid for. It's not a financial burden to your family.
Yeah, and I love how you said there's different options. And I know since we're an international nonprofit, we'll always say that so obviously, if you didn't notice from our accents, Meghan and I are American. So most of what we're referring to will reference organ donation and transplant in the United States. But really, it is just that quick Google search of when you're if our UK group, obviously you're on Google UK when you're looking at it, and that's just your national registry. And it is pretty much like you said, when you're able to kind of see that it's not just when you're at the MV, but then also to do it online, that really does help answer questions. And what's wonderful that I've noticed is so many websites that are educational about organ donation will link the national registry of whatever country they're in on it right away, regardless, which I think is sort of a great cross way of using the internet through a lot of the other organizations too.
Absolutely. And the great thing about online too is you can go in and edit it at any time, so should you change your mind at some point, or, if there's at this time you're not comfortable wanting to be a tissue donor, but maybe 5 years down the line you decide that's something you want to do. By doing it online, you absolutely have the opportunity to go in whenever and edit your decision.
Yeah, and that's really important too, because I know something we'll get asked a lot too on the other end is if it's dangerous to be an organ donor, especially from a living donor perspective. So how would you answer that question?
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely not dangerous to be an organ donor. I think the number one thing when talking about that people worry about is, should something happen to me, if first responders see that I'm an organ donor, are they not going to, take the same steps and try to save my life? And the answer is no. That does not come into play at all. Their first priority is to save your life. Same with the doctors. Should you go to the hospital, their very first priority is to save your life. And it's when, all measures have been exhausted and you are brain dead. So you are officially, determined to have passed, that's even brought into consideration. And so at no point, would it be dangerous to register as a donor from that aspect. And as far as living donation, it's not, I wouldn't say it's dangerous. Obviously, when you undergo surgery, any surgery, there's always some risk, right? So even to go get your tooth pulled or something, there's some risk. So there's going to be those typical surgical potential risks, but the doctors are going to do, everything in their care to prevent that. You'll actually have your own surgical team and transplant coordinator, anesthesiologist. Everybody will be dedicated to you. So they don't work on the recipient. They are solely focused on you, which I think helps give you a peace of mind that this doctor, their top priority is your health and keeping you healthy. And they're not even thinking about the recipient. And then afterwards, it's not a really tough recovery. It's maybe a week in the hospital and a couple months before you're back to normal. But, a lot of donors that I've spoken to, they're doing all the same things that they did before donation. And you're also followed very carefully afterwards to make sure that you're healthy. So there's a lot of steps in place to make sure that should you be a donor, that it is healthy for you. And should you register as a donor, that you do not need to be worried about whether life-saving measures would be taken for you.
Yeah. And I think that's really, like you said, it's important that we'll always say any surgery is a surgery. So what it's like listening to the commercials on medications, they always throw in the potential of dying at the end of all of the potential side effects, even if it is Tylenol, you're going to hear it regardless. So it's really important to like you said, to know that like you said, the doctors that would be specifically in charge of you, whether you're the recipient or the donor, they're really going to give you the different scenarios of what could happen in surgery based on your health and where you're at. 'Cause obviously, if you're the recipient, your health is in a very different position than your donor, who is in probably a much more prime medical position than you're in. And so that really does play a role for you too, that the other doctor for the transplant recipient is going to probably go through a lot of other options, which I know we'll talk about later when we talk about your transplant experience. But that's so true to really, if you have questions and worries about the experience, you can always ask your medical professional.
Yeah. And like you said, you go through rigorous testing before being a liver donor, or if you're going to be a deceased donor, they do a lot of testing too to make sure, you are in good health, to be a donor. But as a living donor, you get so many, pretty much every test under the sun done to make sure you are healthy. And that being said, I think it's also important, as I mentioned, you have your own team. Those tests don't only include, physical tests, but, psychological, mental, emotional, making sure that you're going to be okay, both before, during, and after surgery. And I think the other thing that's good to know is that should you decide to do that, because you have your own team, you can choose to back out at any time. You're not locked in. So, if a couple months down the line, you just think, this really isn't for me, you can back out, and that medical team will, just say it's for medical reasoning. They are not going to tell the recipient why. And so I think that's important to know too, is that it's not, you're not locked in while you're going through that process. And like you mentioned, it's important to talk to your medical team about any questions you may have, but it's certainly not like once you register as a donor, you're going to be forced to do this.
Yeah, and that was even going to be one of the questions I was going to ask for people. So you just kind of answered it, was people think it's very definitive. Everything if I sign up when I'm doing my driver's license, it's definitive. I can't back out. If I do a living donor for a relative or somebody else, I can't back out. And so it's a lot of when you and I had chatted, a big thing that was always on my end was, or can I choose certain organs to keep if I'm a donor when I pass away? And it's not something that's commonly discussed because you think it's all or nothing.
Right.
And so to know that you still have a sense of choice and decision and independence in what you're comfortable doing, it kind of increases your interest in being able to be an organ donor, because you're able to kind of manage through and know, I'm able to change this at any point. My family will know if I'm changing it. And so you're able to have a bit more flexibility in something that traditionally seems like it's a very finite decision.
Absolutely. Yes. So when you register, and like I said, you can edit it at any time. You can choose, what organs, if you also want to be a tissue donor or a cornea donor, or if you would choose for your organs to be donated for, medical research, and you can edit that at any time. I think, it's still also important, while you filling out that donor registration is considered a legal binding document, I do think, which means for you, if that's your decision, then should the time come that you die in a way that you can be an organ donor, that will be considered a legal decision that you made. And I highly recommend doing that. It takes the burden off of your family trying to decide what maybe you would have wanted. It's laid out clear in stone for them. I recommend also having that discussion with your family members, just so they know too. But I do think it's really important to register your decision, so that when it comes that time, that's one less thing they have to try to determine what maybe you would have wanted. It's clear for them. And I think, another interesting thing is that you have to really die in a specific way to be able to be an organ donor, right? So you need to be on a ventilator, you pronounce brain death, but your heart still needs to be beating and distributing blood to all of your organs. And so really only 3 out of 100 people die in a way that they can be an organ donor. So
wow. Drop that statistic, Megan. I didn't know that.
Yes. So, the odds are actually that, you probably won't die in a way that you can be an organ donor. So that makes it even more special if you are able to be. But I think, that's another thing is, people worry about registering, and then they're just going to want to, if I die, I want my organs. And it's highly likely that they probably can't even use them if you don't die in a way that they're able to. So I think for some people that alleviates that worry too.
Oh yeah, definitely. And what I was going to ask to end this segment, what would be for you from doing work with Donate Life and going through your transplant process would be the number one question you think people ask when it comes to the organ donation process and they're debating on registering or even on their end doing organ donation for themselves and being a transplant recipient?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a couple, that whole first responders won't save me, or is my family going to be charged? Those things we've talked about are some of the top questions. I think I also hear a lot, well, I have XYZ disease, or I'm too old, people wouldn't want my organs. And I would definitely say, don't self-rule yourself out. You don't really know. And if it's something that you think you would like to do, register, let the doctors make that decision, and don't exclude yourself just because you think, you might have, kidney problems, but your heart and lungs could be totally healthy and totally, usable in that case. You just never know. So I highly recommend to, don't rule yourself out. Let the doctors make that decision should the time come. And then I think the other big question I will typically see or hear is people talking about religion and whether or not, it's their religion supports it. And right now in the world, all of the major well-known religions support organ donation. But that, again, is something, I would recommend talking to your spiritual advisor or spiritual leader about that decision, if that's, something you want to consider. But all of the major religions have made a stance that they support organ donation. So I think that's, another question that I typically hear.
Yeah, and I love how you mentioned it when it comes from a health perspective, because obviously us in the chronic illness disability space, this is the big thing you are more proactive in wanting to support other people with health issues. So they're probably a population that's more inclined to register because there is that sort of empathetic way of viewing other people.
Right.
And so it's really, like you said, allow the doctors or even allow your own doctor to say, yes, you can totally register, or let your doctor say, I don't really think at any point something from you is going to work for anybody, and let them be tell you, I don't think this is going to be an option for you. Right. So like you said, I think that that's a really good point to make for our listeners and viewers to know. And then before we go into our next segment, I was trying to really in the back of my head think of a snappy way to do our commercial and transition, but there wasn't one because of that. So we're just going to go right into you guys know what we are going to share. Not only are we encouraging you guys to subscribe and like this episode, you'll see those little buttons popping up. And while you're listening to me talk about InvisiYouth Charity Shop, make sure you click that subscribe button, that like button, thumbs up, 5 stars while I'm chatting about this for the next few seconds, because that really does help us out at the podcast and at InvisiYouth Charity Shop. Another quick way you can support our nonprofit and do a little activism and shopping for yourself is buying one of our items like what we have now. I'm wearing it, as you can see if you're on our YouTube channel, and it'll pop up next to me with a graphic, is our subtle activism color block bracelets. They're handmade by young people with chronic illness and disability. They're only $4 to purchase, and they are, like we said, our subtle activist way of showing your support to the chronic illness and disability space for young adults across that whole spectrum of physical and mental health. And it all 100% of all of the proceeds go towards helping fund all of our programming and resources we provide for free every month. So it is a quick and stylish way to donate to our nonprofit, and you get something in return as well. So go to it's on our Etsy store, and you can buy one of our subtle activist color block bracelets for we're getting to the end of the year, guys. Stock them now, give them to people for the holidays. It's the best kind of gift. It's a gift that gives back. So, and now that we did our scheduled programming commercial right there, we are going to go into our next segment with Meghan called Path to Power.
Path to Power.
with Path to Power, Meghan, like I mentioned at the top in her bio, is not only a transplant recipient, but she's also been a family member to someone who has received an organ, someone who's donated an organ, and an ambassador to advocating for organ donation. So multifaceted perspectives over here to tap into with our special guests. So we really want to encourage about learning about the transplant experience, how Meghan has really empowered herself and gained power through her journey and all these different points of view, so you guys can learn from her. So I really think one of the things I was going to mention on your end, what was sort of the difference, since your brother had his transplant first, being a family member going through that experience versus then you being the recipient yourself? Was there a major difference you noticed between those two times in your life?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, as my brother went through the process first as a recipient and as the sister and the family member, I think for me, it was a lot more nerve-wracking. It was our also first personal really experience with organ donation. So didn't really know what to expect, you know, how he would do. My brother was also, his disease developed a lot faster than mine for whatever reason. So he's younger than me, but had to be transplanted first. He actually developed liver cancer, which kind of sped the process and need for him to get a transplant. And so on top of his, you know, transplant, we were also worrying about how had the cancer spread. And so I think for me, I was just really nervous for him. And then after being able to see him go through that process and, you know, recovery wasn't easy, but afterwards, you know, kind of getting to go back to college and live, you know, a somewhat normal life. I think it gave me a lot of hope then for my transplant. And I had known, I think it's a little different too, because with him, it was so unexpected. Like transplant was presented kind of as the only option at that point. And I think it was just kind of like, what? And then for me, it was like, after he had his, it was always in the back of my mind, like, you know, the doctor said, we can't say for certain that you will need one because we have no idea what's going on with you guys. But the odds, you know, it's probably likely that somewhere down the line you will need one. So I think always in the back of my mind, I kind of knew that like, that will be me. And some people may see that as pessimistic. I see it as realistic. For me,
it's like a waiting game too, because you're kind of just waiting, being it, like you said, that it's a realist sort of way of looking at it. And you're just kind of waiting for the option to happen.
Yeah. So just kind of waited. And then when that time came and they were like, you know, I think it's time for you to get listed, while there was still a little bit of like nerves with that, I think, you know, I had expected it. I knew kind of what to expect in the process. And then I don't think I was nearly as nervous going into my own transplant as I was for my brother's, just because also I had the same surgeon, same anesthesiologist. I knew the team really well and my family knew the team really well. We had a lot of trust in them. And so I think that helped as well. So yeah, I would say I was more nervous as a family member than as a patient.
And I love how you said it was a lot of it's because the stress was sort of uncontrollable on your end. Because I will always say, as someone with a chronic illness or disability, you are, as much as your body kind of dictates what you can and cannot do, you are a bit in the driver's seat in terms of your reaction to things, because it is your own health. So being the support network, it does provide a different level and type of anxiety than anything else, because you can't control what, if your brother was like, I'm going to start doing a jog, and you're like, please don't, no running. You're like out of control in that way. So it provides this different level of stress, sort of being on the receiving end. I think in a weird way, it kind of gives you this different level of empathy, because we'll always say, well, put the shoe on the other foot. If your family is being a little bit of annoying or tapping, being that sort of backseat driver, wanting you to try new treatments and doctors, and you just want to adapt to your health or disability and you want to move forward, and they're kind of doing their own opinion. You had the luxury of being on the other end when people would say, well, put the shoe on the other foot and think about what it would be like to watch you going through this. But you actually had that experience on your end. So you didn't have to metaphorically think about it. You did it already. Yeah. But I think, like you said, that's important because it does give you a different perspective. And then something you kind of touched on in the last segment, which was super important that I wanted to mention here, was living with chronic illness or disability and going into surgical procedures or major events through that journey. We'll always hear, even with my spine surgery, my surgeon said to me, you need to be training your body but you also need to be as mentally fit to go into the surgery to then deal with the recovery. So I need you to really do what work you need to be mentally fit for this, because it's going to be a process in your recovery after. And I would imagine, like you said, for the transplant process, that what people don't realize is the after effect of getting an organ is people think, oh, I'm going to be like every medical television show and I'm going to be out of bed 6 weeks, scars finished, barely see my scar, and I am raring to go. No one will even know. So on your end, did you think, what was it like for you, sort of not so much the preparing, but the after prep work of that mental and emotional fitness that you think other people would benefit from learning about?
Yeah, absolutely. It's so funny. While I was in the hospital, it was around the holidays, and I was watching like the Lifetime and Hallmark holiday movies in the hospital. And there was one where the girl got a liver transplant, and it's like, she wakes up and she's just like, gonna go walk now, and it's like, that's not real. But yeah, I think, it was the recovery process and kind of adapting with life post-transplant, I would argue, is almost just as difficult as the physical, recovery of the transplant itself. And I mentioned my brother was in college when he had his transplant. So I was there in the very beginning, but then he went back to school after a couple months. And I feel like I just had this idea that like, oh, he just went back to school. Like he was doing great. Like, and it wasn't until after my transplant, and I'm just like, I was sitting there one day and I was like, I don't know how Eric went back to college. Like I took 3 months off of work and then went back part-time for like another 3 months. So I'm like, how did he go back? My dad was like, he was taking one class that next semester. Like, I thought he was like on a full schedule. Like, I was like, he was like, that was amazing. My dad was like, no, he couldn't do that. So I think, it was just realizing that I had to slow down, and also just giving in to my feelings. I'm not a big, like, touchy-feely kind of share my emotions person, but kind of saying, like, if I have the right to cry. Like, I've been through a lot. I can cry about this. And just trying to take it one step at a time and celebrate the little wins, any little thing. And just reminding myself it's a journey. Like, this is a huge journey. I was transplanted in December of 2019. So then the pandemic came 2 or 3 months later. So that kind of made things, I think, even more so. I had this idea that like, okay, around 3 months, like, be able to go out and do things again. And I couldn't, because, I'm on immunosuppressants. I'm high risk for, and so I think it just took a lot of just no expectations, like adapting, recognizing that everybody is different, and their recovery is going to look different. I feel very fortunate that I saw with my brother that he had some, I don't want to call them setbacks, but just minor things, little bile duct leaks, and he had to get stents. And I remember when that happened to him the first time, my family was so nervous, because it was like, is the transplant, like, did something go wrong in the surgery? Like, panic. And then the same thing happened for me. And it was like, oh, now we know it's normal. Like, we kind of expected this. And so I think just knowing that, like, that's not a setback per se, like, things happen. It's like I said, it's a journey. You're going to have ups and downs on that recovery. And so not setting yourself up to like have these expectations, like, in 6 months, I'm going to do this, because you just never know how you're going to be or how the world's going to be. Right. So, I think that's the biggest thing, is just, don't compare yourself to others, and don't set unrealistic expectations, and just celebrate the little wins.
Yeah. And ironically, you had second child syndrome and you're the eldest of the two.
I know.
In a weird way. Everyone just was like, oh, it'll be fine when it happens to Meghan.
I remember at my brother's transplant, I swear all my extended family was there. Like everybody was like freaking out. Like I remember my parents were panicking, and then it's like the day of mine. It's like, okay, we're here. Like some people showed up, like, and I was like, what is going on? But it's because they had been, they've been through it. So yeah, I had total second child syndrome as the oldest.
And I love how you said everything was a process, and it's not only processing everything for yourself, but also the whole thing is a process. You don't have to hit these benchmarks that your doctors give you, these sort of wide stroke like benchmarks of around this time period, you can do X, Y, and Z. And you kind of expect you to be able to just kind of hit the benchmark, you check it off, you move to the next one. But there is a lot of fluctuation in that process. Even like you said, your age, you were working, but your brother was in college. So what you both had to adapt in would be totally different just on lifestyle, let alone age and how both of your transplants went. And I think that's so important as people to realize the recovery process. And what I've learned through InvisiYouth is it's lifelong. People don't assume I get an organ, I'm great after a certain while. And the only way people would know is if I show them my scar, and that's it. Right. And I've learned that's really not the case. There's medication, you go back to doctors. No one can see this, but Meghan's face when I said there's medications went lots of medication.
Oh yeah. Tons of medication. And it does taper down a little bit, but that's another thing that's totally different, right? So my brother, after about a year, he was on like 2 medications, super low dose of anti-rejection medicine, has been like soaring like that ever since. I'm like, will be 3 years out in December. I still take like a handful of pills twice a day. And it's just because we're different. First of all, he's male, I'm female. I have to worry about my like osteoporosis more than he does because I'm a female. So like making sure I'm supplementing on calcium and vitamin D that he doesn't have to worry about. And my body reacts different. I had really bad tremors from my first anti-rejection medicine. He had them a little bit in the beginning. It's normal, but mine never gave up. So I think that's the other thing is like, you can't compare medications, like things like that. And it's a journey. It's something that you're going to be on medication the rest of your life. And adjusting to that can be a hard, mindset too, because with medications can come side effects, right? So it's like, I will never be back to who I was. And it's honestly hard to remember what it was like to not even be sick, which I know a lot of chronically ill people.
Very true.
Right. It's like, you just don't even remember what that was like. And I don't think I'll ever completely remember that, but it doesn't mean that my quality of life is less. You just learn to adapt. And I'm always just thinking back to, I'm grateful, like at least I'm living my life, right? Like the alternative was to not be. So for me, I'm still, incredibly grateful. And I just take those things with a grain of salt, because it's like what I have to do in order to live. But I think, you mentioned being at different points in your life. And I think this is, again, something anybody with a chronic illness can relate to. But with organ transplants, it's kind of rare to be in your young adulthood and be getting a transplant. It's oftentimes you're older, or maybe retired, or you'll see a lot of times with babies, right? You'll get a transplant when you're born. So I'm in this like kind of weird age group. And I remember, and it's all meant well, but there was somebody from our local TRIO organization, which is transplant, it's like a transplant support group. And he came in to talk to me after transplant and about the group and stuff. And it was just like, this was really a nice gesture, but almost everybody in that group is like retired, right? So the things that they're talking about, like, I'm just like, that doesn't apply to me. Like, I need to get better and go to a job. I need to figure out what dating's like after this huge thing. And, it's like, not the same page. Like, and again, it's like nobody's experience is the same, but like, I was just looking for somebody who could just be like, I had to return to work too. Or like, I'm trying to date as an immunosuppressed organ recipient during a pandemic, like, you know, like,
just add all the complications onto
like,
your dating
yeah,
profile.
literally. Yeah, it's like, yeah, that's a whole nother thing. It's like, at what point do I just like mention this and like straight up, like, you better be vaccinated because we're not going on a date, you know, like, but the things you have to like consider. And so that's why I actually started even sharing on social media. It was to try to find that common ground with some young people who were same things that I was.
And I love that in the comments for your social media is it's so many different points of view, and it's never anyone saying your way is better than my way. It's just always people comparing and having like a fun way of comparing with one another. And even kind of the last thing I was going to ask before we went in our intermission was the one thing you kind of touched on when you mentioned, like, how do you reveal this sort of portion of your health with other people, was I know you even talk about often about that portion of it, but then also sharing your scar and meeting other people who have similar scars. And I know, and that's sort of with the chronic illness and disability space, that sort of body acceptance of the way medication or surgeries or wearing medical equipment and accessories, it's that sort of very visible representation of something. So for you, how has that sort of post-transplant been for you, and kind of finding your own power and confidence in sort of people just being able to notice if you show your scar, they're going to ask, what is that from? Because it's not like a little cut. No. And I love how very obvious you are when on social media meeting other people who have similar scars, and you're like, that guy, I know right away.
Exactly. Yeah, it was actually so funny because as I mentioned, my transplant was like 2 months before the pandemic. And as a newly transplanted person, before even this whole pandemic was brought into like thought, they recommended I wear a mask when I went out because I was on such high immunosuppressants. And this is when, like, you know, the COVID was starting overseas. It hadn't made its way over here yet. And I could just tell, like, I tried to avoid most public places at the time, but if I had to go into like a store, you could just tell, like, people were like, that girl is so paranoid about, you know, this virus overseas. Like, they had, you know, it was like, they had no idea. And then I like to say, I'm like, I was a trendsetter before masks were cool. I was wearing the mask, but it, you know, it can be, you know, difficult with things like that. And having people kind of stare. I learned pretty much off the bat, I started sharing the fact that I had a transplant. And I think that's part of that was COVID, because like I said, like at the time I was single and I wanted to start, you know, dating, but I wasn't going to go out on a date in a huge public place during the pandemic, or I wasn't going to go with somebody who wasn't vaccinated because that wouldn't be a safe choice for me. And so it just kind of right off the bat, bringing it up. And I will say there were people who definitely were like, unmatched, like that sounds difficult, you know? And then you just know that's not the right person for you, right? Same with like friendships. If friends can't, you know, deal with those kinds of things, like if I had, you know, people in my life who weren't vaccinated, I wasn't going to see them, family or not. And it's just kind of like, you have to do what's best for you. And I had no problem being vocal about my transplant in that aspect. And then talking about the scars. Yeah, and like, you know, being on prednisone and weight gain, I'm not where I was before transplant. And that's a really hard adjustment too.
Yeah.
And so I think I just, over time, I can remember the first time going to like the beach with my scar and being really like a little uncomfortable with it. And then I just was like, to the point, like, I don't really care, you know, like if somebody, you know, wants to ask me about it, that's fine. I'm open about it. And I'm just not going to pay attention to the people who are like looking at me and like, you know, staring funny. I think the first time I really wore like a two-piece bathing suit at the beach was on my friend's joint bachelor and bachelorette party. And I remember the guys were very inebriated.
Oh no.
And one of them asked me about it. And I was just like, yeah, that's my shark bite, you know, like, and he was like, what? And I was like, yeah, you know, be careful out there in that ocean. Like sometimes I just would have fun with it, but I think, you know, you just embrace it. It's a part of me now. It's a part of my story. It's why I'm alive. So there's no shame with it. And I think, you know, I just roll with it. I just, I try not to compare myself to other people. And that's a game you play, whether or not you're chronically ill or have had surgery or not, right? You're always going to compare yourself. So I'm no different than anybody else. Just maybe have different areas that I'm maybe uncomfortable with, but everybody has something that they, beat themselves up about. And so it's no different. And just knowing that, everybody's going through the same thing as me. And just because I have this scar, I'm not going to hide it.
Yeah, no. And I love how you said a big thing with it when it comes to sort of that embracing the way that you look with a chronic illness disability, or on your end being post-transplant. It's really your responses to other people really can fluctuate. And I always say not so much about how the other person reacts, but just how you feel in that day. Because some days I am ready to go and give you the Wikipedia of my illnesses and explain to you why I have a cane and why my limbs are 2 different colors. And I'm just ready to go and explain my scar on my back. I'm fine. Other days don't really feel like it. Yeah. And you just have to learn to just, if you're uncomfortable and you see it, move. Yeah. Other days, the humor is my reaction because maybe I'm a little bit annoyed and I want to throw in the humor. Yeah. Some days I'm ready for a little bit of, I'm a little annoyed too. Give you direct eye contact. If you look at me, I'm looking right back until Beth is going to look away and it won't be me. And so I always will say that's a big thing, just in a way that kind of gives you confidence over time with the different portions of your body or your health that are more visible, because you're kind of giving yourself the control of, I can react anyway. If I explain it to one person, that doesn't mean next month, if something happens, I have to explain it to them. You can just kind of really pick it in your way. And like you said, even when it comes to dating, certain people you might have felt an immediate, be like, they know, they look like they might be able, you might have done a little Instagram dive and been like, oh, okay, they've gone to blood drives and they have relatives that have health issues. And so they're going to get it right away. Where someone else, they might not have looked like they would understand, and let me sort of get to know them first, and then I can mention it. And so it does, like you said, in any aspect, you can really kind of learn the way that works best for you in different situations and change that based on how you feel and not others.
Absolutely. It's all about what you're comfortable with, and you never owe anybody an explanation about your health. I think that's really important. And you never know what people are going through. And I think for those who aren't, it's an important point to make too, is, you might see me on the street and think I look completely healthy like this, but I'm not. And I I started getting sick in college, and I dealt with that a little bit with having medications and some not so nice girls saying that, Meghan does drugs. And it's like, if you would just ask what well, first of all, I don't owe you an explanation, but had you just asked, I would have told you what this was for, so I think, it's a lesson for both sides that, you can share what you're comfortable with. You don't owe anyone an explanation. And if you see somebody maybe doing something you don't understand, or you don't think they look, you just don't ever know people's circumstances. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's a really good before weeks. Obviously, I love Meghan's mini stories, but we're going to get an actual full-on story time with Meghan soon. But before we do that, we're in our intermission, our halfway point in our podcast episode. So we always thank all of you guys for getting to this point in the podcast. We're going to have fun in our next 2 segments with Meghan, so we encourage you to stay tuned. And like always, we always do, as a nonprofit, we do drop our donation link. You can see it on the screen, and it's in the show notes, because as a nonprofit, all of our programming and resources is free every month to help empower and improve the daily life for young people who have chronic illnesses and disabilities around the world. So in order for us to continue providing free resources like this podcast, donations of any size, we always say even the $1 are super beneficial to us to help us be able to continue providing everything for free. So we always drop that on the below so you can support or share in any way. And now we're going to go into everyone's favorite time of the podcast episode. It's So That One Time.
So that one time.
right, Megan, I'm going to drink my coffee and let you tell all of us a story. So the mic is yours.
Sounds good. Okay. I struggled with trying to think of a good story around transplant. And I'm sure there are so many, but those transplant meds kind of mess with your memory. And I'm like,
brain
yes,
fog.
I'm like, what am I going to talk about? So this will be short and sweet. But I think it's kind of funny. And so I can remember when my brother came out of transplant, and I was so worried about going up to the ICU after surgery, because when I got to go in and see him, it was like, all I can remember is him like moaning in pain. Like this was like ingrained in my head. Like I feel like moaning in pain and just like clicking that pain button. Right. And the nurse being like, don't worry, it doesn't work all every the time. 2 minutes. Yeah. And he's just like,
spoiler.
Yeah. He's just like clicking at it. And so I was like, oh my gosh, like that first hour in the ICU. I mean, you end up not remembering really any of it, but I was like, that's going to be the worst. Like, I just remember he was in so much pain. I come out of surgery and they're like, she woke up and immediately started cracking jokes, like just making jokes. And this is like, I've heard this before, like when I'm like getting ready to go under anesthesia or coming out, I just start like making jokes. I'm like, I don't even know what jokes. I don't come prepared. Like, I don't know what I've been saying. But so I guess I overheard the anesthesiologist telling somebody like in the OR, or I don't know who she was telling, but they were like, she did amazing, like during transplant. So then they would let like 2 people at a time come into my room, and they would just be like, Megan, how are you doing? And I was just like, I'm freaking amazing. Like, that's all I would say to people. I was like, I'm freaking amazing. Like, and they were like, I think she's good. Like my dad was like, it was so opposite, like between your brother and you. And I'm like, yeah, because girls can tolerate pain better.
And what was your brother's reaction though, when he came in to see how you were doing post-op? Was he like, damn it?
So he was not there right away.
Okay.
Because he was still in school. So he did not come up right away, but he probably, well, like I said, he doesn't even remember. And I don't really remember this either. It's just everybody being like, yeah, all you kept saying was, I'm freaking amazing. I'm freaking amazing. Like over and over again. And they were like, I guess she's good. seems like everything went well. So I don't know why I'm like that after anesthesia, but I guess I just, make jokes and
you're freaking amazing.
I'm just freaking amazing. Yeah. My aunt got me like this little like water bottle sleeve that was like, said something like, I'm amazing or something. Like now it's like the family joke, like, oh, Megan's freaking amazing. But I'm like, yeah, I don't know. But that's, I guess, how I was feeling. Certainly not once I actually like could realize what was going on. Yeah. But at that point in time, I thought life was great.
And my post anesthesia is I'm like Bridgerton level, like that, like I'm so nice to people in like a very, very like, it's hysterical. I'm just like full, well, thank you so much for providing this for me. I have no idea where it comes from. Once I'm getting that, I am just thanking everybody under the sun. When they come in the room, I'm so congratulating them for being there. When they leave, I'm thanking them for providing service. My mom is like, etiquette level is, the nurses were like, wow, she is so polite all the time. My mom's like, well, she is, but this is just like, the etiquette was full on. Like I could just be there at that point for some reason.
So funny. For whatever, it's like so funny that you could be like that. And like some people just like cry immediately, or like always, when I come out of anesthesia, I don't know why, I'm mad at my mom. Like she hasn't done anything. I'm just mad. Like, don't want to talk to her. Like I don't, and like, she's like, what did I do? I'm like, I don't know what it is, but I just like, am always mean to, I feel terrible. It got to the point that like for little like stent removals, like my dad became the person that took me because I was just like brutal to her. And I don't know why, but yeah, anesthesia's funny.
Oh my God. I love that. And even Megan's freaking amazing. And going into our next segment, we're going to prove that in our segment, Rebel Game Changer Status.
Rebel Game Changer Status.
All right, Rebel Game Changer status. We are going to take a fresh take on our beloved segment and really use our Rebel Game Changer minds to break some misconceptions when it comes to organ donation and transplant, and hopefully get some of you guys that are on the fence learning about registering to feel that comfort, or even have better open dialogues about the organ donation process. So the one thing I was going to ask, we kind of touched on it a little bit in a different segment, was so much of the organ donation and transplant experience, similar to the chronic illness and disability experience, the media representation tends to not be the most accurate, or it kind of pigeonholes in one area. So what do you feel are kind of the pitfalls of the way that the media, whether that's film or even news, kind of discusses organ transplant? And what do you feel could be like a good shift in a way of still bringing, if it's film and entertainment value, but what would be kind of your thing if they did this little change and showing this, it would probably give people a better perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the biggest thing right now is, you know, a lot of times in these primetime TV shows, it's just an inaccurate portrayal, both on a donor and recipient side. So for a donor, it'll be like, you know, just like immediately like, you know, oh, we have this person and now their organs match our patient who we've been waiting for 10 years for a liver, and they just came in and now it's a perfect match. And like, that doesn't work that way. And same with like, you know, recipients, with it being like, like just the recovery period being like I talked about earlier, just being like, I'm just going to hop out of bed and take a stroll now. Or like, you know, being able to like so quickly find a match a lot of times in TV shows, like it's just not a very realistic portrayal. And I think a lot of times it can be harmful for people who are a little unsure about organ donation when they see it portrayed inaccurately. I do think there are some shows recently that have tried to make it a little bit more accurate. And I know there's kind of an arm of Donate Life Hollywood that tries to work with producers of some of these medical shows and make sure that it's a more accurate portrayal, because it is hard to portray the whole process in like a 1 hour episode, but to try to keep it as, you know, realistic as possible, I think is really important. And to show people, you know, I love that a lot of shows now will show like a donor walk and how they respect a donor before they donate their organs, or, you know, checking the list with UNOS or, you know, things like that, just trying to make it a little more accurate. As far as the news goes, I feel like a lot of times the stories you hear are probably the negatives, and we don't so much share maybe the positive stories. And those negatives, like any kind of news, are usually like the little percentage of organ donation stories. But when it's something negative, I do think there's been a lot of focus and interest on like innovation in organ donation. And I think that's important to focus on too, because, you know, exploring things like xenotransplantation or stem cell organs is really important when, you know, we have over 100,000 people waiting for organs in the US alone. So I think, you know, if we can try to focus on the positive and realistic aspects of it, I think it's important to talk about and to bring it forefront in people's minds. And I do love when shows kind of maybe at the end of an episode that discussed organ donation mention registering and registerme.org or something like that. So I think it should be in the media and in conversations. We just need to make sure we're portraying it in the right way.
Yeah, and I love how you said it really does hit on the emotional side, I think is what will bring in sort of the fear element or sort of the sadness element, even from the chronic illness and disability space. It really does kind of, it hits on either the very sympathetic vote or there's a lot of drama and turmoil. And you don't kind of, even if you want to bring the drama for television or if it's a news story to like hit the emotion of a viewer or a listener, to bring in like elements of the joyful part of it, the experience portion of it probably will, because that does sort of subconsciously always sit in someone's head. So when they do meet someone who's had a transplant or needs one, or if somebody asks about registering and they're on the fence, you're always thinking of what you've seen before or heard before. And you're going to assume like, the horror slasher film is probably coming from some element of truth, or like those medical dramas, it comes from somewhere, and you goes, well, the idea is truthful, and then you let the creative writers go and explore, is how I say it. So it's always, when a medical drama is 100% accurate, you're shocked as somebody who has the illness. You're like, wow, they didn't care at all about entertainment. They went straight for realism, and I appreciate it. But it's something that is, like you said, is really important to feed in sort of the positive portions of stories, but then also kind of take the extremes and then kind of add something to it that just kind of shows a little bit of the what recovery would be. Let them do something that's more realistic, bringing somebody in, and like that kind of allows the human element of storytelling is probably the thing that ironically lacks the most in representation of stories like this. And even one thing I was going to ask too, before we end, was I know a big thing for us was when people are when they are discussing registering or organ donation, it can be one of these like more hot button topics with family members or friends. And some people are on the fence, and other people, whether it's sort of spiritually, or they're like, I don't want to part with my body parts. That seemed like a run on as I was saying it, in a weird way. But for you, what are ways that you feel are good to kind of tackle those kind of maybe even uncomfortable conversations when you can see that there's like a differing of opinion without feeling like you're going to get in a conflict or try to force somebody to view your way?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think for me, when I'm talking about organ donation, I'm talking about my personal experience. And I like to kind of bring it back to that, because I mentioned before, people our age aren't typically getting transplants. So a lot of times they might not know anybody who's been through that. And so I think sometimes when you bring that human element into it, and I'm like, an organ donation saved somebody like me, like that's, I am like the picture of who it could help. I think sometimes it's like, oh my gosh, like I actually can put a face to somebody that like, that could be me. So like I said, a lot of times you think like, oh, they're older or, whatever, but I think it's good to think about like that. I could be the one very well. You are more likely to need an organ transplant than to be an organ donor. Like that's a fact. So I like to kind of think of it that way, like if you were in need, you would probably want somebody to be a donor and to be able to help you. But I think, everybody has the right to their own beliefs. And just because I'm a firm believer in organ donation, and my personal opinion is everybody should register, I don't, hold that against somebody who has their own reasons for not wanting to. And I think the most important thing is, educate yourself, and not rely on the media, go to like, Donate Life America's website or things like that, and get, truthful resources. And I always tell people, I'm happy if you are against organ donation, I'm not going to argue it with you, but I'm happy to send you the facts. Like, here's the facts, and make your own decision, but use those. I think it's an important conversation to have with family members. Like I mentioned earlier, you may not agree on things, but that's why it's important to let them know what you specifically want. And it's important that if you do want to be an organ donor, that you register and make that, legal binding document, because I wouldn't want to put, my family obviously knows I'm very passionate about organ donation and would want to be an organ donor. But if that weren't the case, I would hate for them to have to like make that call and figure out like, what would Meghan have wanted? And especially if, I was really pro donation and maybe my family members weren't. And then it's like, that just causes internal turmoil for them to figure out what to do. And it just, I think, gives a lot of peace of mind to know that you've legally made this decision, you're registered. Inform your family, maybe tell them the reason, why you made this decision and why it's important to you. And definitely have those conversations. But I think, making your own decision is very powerful, and doing that on your own, and, doing the research and making that decision based off what's most comfortable for you, and not relying on, the opinions of others or the opinions of the media.
Yeah.
is what I recommend.
Yeah. And like you said, too, it's always going into a conversation like that, not with the end goal of trying to convince somebody to be on the same mindset as you, but opening their mind instead of changing their mind.
Yes.
So that at least they will, even if they still wouldn't want to register, their understanding of all of the different, like you said, that you can register and then not. You can choose if certain organs you're more attached to versus other, or tissue versus organs. You can do those sort of choices as well. And you can kind of know that information is really beneficial. That at least we'll always say, even on the chronic illness and disability space, if somebody won't proactively get involved in the way that would be beneficial, like registering for organ donation, maybe even encourage them to donate blood instead, because that's beneficial. So there's different ways that if there's sort of a hard line for someone, that you can always have them compromise somewhere else, that in a way it's still helping your whole process. They're still supporting sort of the whole process of this. And so if you try to go in and kind of are banging on the door to change their mind, you more likely than not make them even more uncomfortable to even be open to that conversation in the conversations they might have later on. So like you said, that's really important to talk with your family about it, understand everyone's different opinions, but then know that I just want people to kind of know all these different facts and be open-minded to the different ways that they can help the full process.
Yes, absolutely.
And that's sort of a really, we're gonna end the show on a positive, perky note. We're gonna do that. But Meghan, thank you so much for being on the show today. I thoroughly appreciate it, and I want to make sure everybody can find you on social media, and like you mentioned, the different major websites that are for the United States that you can then compare to when you're in other countries.
Yeah, absolutely. You can find me on Instagram at Meghan Making Moves. It's MEGHAN Making Moves. My mom had to make it complicated with an H. But you can find me on Instagram there. In the US, I highly recommend, like I said, if you want to register, go to registerme.org. If you want to find out more information, there's donatelife.net. A lot of your states probably have their own Donate Life, branches. And then if you're outside of the United States, I think, if you just look up organ donation in your country, that those resources should be readily available with a quick internet search.
Absolutely. And we're going to have those links below so you guys can check out Meghan on social media, and also learning more about organ donation and the transplant process. And as always, you can find InvisiYouth on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at InvisiYouth. And you can subscribe to our YouTube channel if you're watching it here, or any of our audio podcast platforms to check out future episodes of our 2 episodes a month on InvisiYouth Chat Sessions. So thank you guys so much for joining the podcast episode, and I will speak with you all soon. Bye, everybody.